Welcome back to the Sustainable Design Lab podcast. I'm Brodie, Vander, Dussen.
And I'm Chris Bradley. And today we're exploring a part of packaging that's often invisible, but it's absolutely central. What happens after people throw it away?
Today we are joined by a friend of the lab, Julia Mangin. She's the Director of Sustainability and Government Affairs at Recology. I'm so excited to get to share this conversation with you guys today. So if you don't know Recology, they are the company who's pioneered curbside composting and modern recycling, especially here on the West Coast.
Exactly. And Recology has been at the forefront of treating waste as a resource. This is a really big concept. And they pushed innovation in recycling and organics recovery. And they've really showed that the end of a product's life is actually the beginning of a whole new cycle. And Julia has been part of that story for more than a decade, shaping how communities and brands really rethink about recovery and design for circularity.
In our conversation, she really helped pull the curtain back from what goes on at Recology and beyond that in the infrastructure we have here in the US. She helps us look at what actually happens when packaging leaves to consumers' hands. Where are the gaps in our current infrastructure? What is her hope for the infrastructure? What's real versus myth when it comes to compostability and recyclability?
And I'd say it's an honest and sometimes uncomfortable look at the messy but essential part of circularity. And it's exactly the perspective that I think that we need if we're serious about making packaging and more specifically, sustainable packaging work in the real world. Let's jump into it.
So Julia, thank you for being a part of the show. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
You've been at Recology for over a decade, starting as an intern, and now have worked your way up to Director of Sustainability and Government Affairs. What first sparked your interest in sustainability, and what continues to inspire you about circular systems and end-of-life side of packaging?
Yeah, it's a privilege to have been somewhere for 10 years, I think. And I definitely think that when I started as an intern, I was not expecting to be at Recology for 10 years, but it's been a company and rather like an industry where I've learned a lot, and every day kind of keeps me there because I'm always learning. But kind of how I got into it was, I think as a kid, I was just always, and into my like young adulthood was always interested in the environment and kind of did all the traditional things, felt like, oh, I'm going to recycle and save the world. And, studied environmental science in college. I think even when I was a kid, I like almost started a little side hustle of collecting cans. Like I collected cans, for my family and stuff and would take them to the deposit depots, but started doing it like for neighbors and family. And, my dad was trying to make it into like a real business for me. It didn't pan out like that. But, I found Recology just, through where I went to school in Berkeley, and Recology was in San Francisco, and started as an intern, and have been through many roles over the 10 years, but I'm loving the role I'm in now.
Julia, so it's been great knowing you the last couple of years, and I've really appreciated your insights, especially because a lot of the people that are probably listening to the show are packaging engineers or people who are directly involved in packaging. So if there's one thing that you wish that every packaging designer could understand about what really happens to their materials once they enter the waste system, what would that be?
Yeah, lots to choose from. I think I'd probably say that a lot of what can be recovered, at least when we're talking about it entering the traditional like curbside recycling system, is that if there's no end market, it won't be recycled. And just simple as that. Like it's not about, does Recology want to accept it? It's not even about, do we have the equipment to accept it, to sort it? It's really that at the end of the day, if there's no one on the back end that's going to buy that material from us, we can't recycle it. We can't recover it. We can invest, millions of dollars into our facilities to have state-of-the-art equipment to, collect every single type of packaging if we wanted to. But we don't do that, and we can't do that because there's no one to buy it on the back end. And so I think there's, a lot of people out there that will say like, well, yes, like PVC is recyclable, and sure, yes, things like that might be true, but there's no one that's going to recycle it or purchase PVC once it's gone through this curbside stream and, gone in the truck and the facility and all of that. No one wants that material, at least. So in our cases, then no, it's not recyclable. So end markets, is a really big piece of this, and something you'll hear a lot of recyclers talk about, especially when it comes to trying to figure out what goes on the accepted list and what doesn't.
No, I think you really bring a great perspective there, because it's always where we're working with brands and they're trying to create new packaging, and they start with, well, this is a recyclable material. But really I think as you've kind of hit on, it really depends on, can somebody make money recycling their packaging at the end of the day? And so when brands design packaging, they often think about recyclability or compostability in theory. But I guess, question in practice, what actually happens once packaging leaves the store? So they are consumer packaged goods, they put it on the store, goes into the consumer's hands. Can you walk us through how compostables, recyclables, and mixed materials move through this kind of real world system that you're involved in?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I think, let's take it from where you said, which is, from the store into a consumer's hand. So after I'm a consumer, I'm done with this packaging. I'm going to discard it in some way. And what happens next actually depends on what they have access to. All of us live in California. We probably have, some of the best systems in the country. And so this example may not be relevant for everyone, but I think it's what maybe everywhere in the country should aspire to, which is a 3-bin system. And Recology actually pioneered that 3-bin system like many, many years ago. But the system would be, a bin for landfill, a bin for recycling, a bin for composting. And the consumers will discard it into the appropriate bins based on, what's accepted. The landfill bin gets picked up, and generally all 3 bins will get picked up and taken to what's called a transfer station. And there it's basically just a facility where the material's taken, gets dumped on the ground, kind of consolidated, and then gets loaded into a bigger truck. And in the case of the landfill material, that gets then sent straight to the landfill. I think a lot of people think what goes in the landfill or black cart or gray cart or whatever color your cart is gets sorted. That does not happen at majority of facilities. In the case of recycling or your blue bin, that will get taken to a material recovery facility, often referred to as a MRF. And that's, a really intricate facility that has, conveyors going every direction. You'll have advanced recycling and sorting equipment like optical sorters, AI robotics in some cases, human sorters as well. We use definitely both. And that's where each of the materials get sorted into their individual commodities. We bale that material, and then we, Recology, aren't actually a recycler. We sell that to a downstream recycler. So in a way, we're just a processor. We're a sorter of the material. And then for composting, that material gets taken to either a composting facility, maybe an anaerobic digestion facility, and turned into either compost or, in the case of anaerobic digestion, renewable energy.
I think that that's a piece of it that not most consumers are aware of how, like, I think people throw it away and it's out of sight, out of mind, and they don't, maybe they know, but don't think about that there is in a way, there's somewhere that all of this goes. And there are people who sort it, who pass it along, who process it. And, it either gets sent to these recyclers and contribute to the circular economy and so on. But I think that there's often a gap between what a phrase I've heard of wish cycling of things, I want this to be recycled and I throw in the blue bin and I hope for the best. I'm curious, from your experience, what are some of the biggest gaps that you're seeing in today's recycling and composting infrastructure?
Yeah, infrastructure is essential. I mean, infrastructure is what makes things possible to be recovered. And so when I think about gaps in infrastructure, it's really, where don't we have infrastructure? I think we, again, live in California, where there's probably, a more advanced and mature market for recycling and composting. Other parts of the country, that is not the case. The Recycling Partnership puts out this report called The State of Recycling. And there's a ton of good data in it. You guys might be familiar with it. But one of the stats that, really is something that I use a lot and surprises people is that 73% of households have access to recycling. So about 3/4 of the country. I think that's relatively good. I think it should be 100, frankly. So it's a little bit of an issue of access, that, again, that number should be 100, but really it's that 76% of what can be recycled at a residential level isn't even making it into the recycling bin. So you have access, but you're having a gap in either it just, people not knowing that it's recyclable, not caring that it's recyclable, not having the proper education. It could be a number of things, but that's a staggering amount of material that, it's not an issue of, oh, we're not sorting well enough. And that can be true too. But really, we're missing a huge portion of the recyclables. Like, they're not even coming to someone like Recology to be recycled across the entire country. So to me, that's a big, gap in the recycling system, specifically for blue bin materials. And then I think when we look at composting, it's actually, interestingly, kind of the inverse. So where, about 75% of the population has access to recycling, 75% of the population doesn't have access to composting. So composting is underfunded, underutilized, and that's why I certainly get a little frustrated when you travel maybe to another state and you're at a stadium where they've got the compostable plastic cups, and then I walk over to the bins and there's no compost bin. And I'm like, who designed this? Who thought this was a good idea? Well, how do they think this is getting compost? They don't compost to begin with, and we can maybe get to that later, but lack of access to any form of composting infrastructure is a gap, especially when, many national packaging companies and brands design products to be composted, knowing, or maybe not knowing, that the majority of the country doesn't have access to composting service.
It's for sure a really important aspect when it comes to designing packaging, whether that's recyclable or compostable or just straight design, is thinking about the end of life for sure.
One comment I'd like to make, you mentioned the 76% of that have access. And they do have some access, but the other stat from that same source that I always love to use is that there's 50 million U.S. households that do not have access to curbside recycling. So that's well over 100+ million people. that are buying products from all of these brands that just have no access at all. And so those products, even though they could be recovered, are not. Yeah.
Right. Because I think that stat, even the 76%, like you said, Chris, it doesn't mean they have curbside. Like a lot of times that can mean they have access, they're within X number of miles to a recycling depot. Well, I don't know about you, but a lot of Americans rely on convenience. This is why we established curbside systems, which is why we went to a single stream recycling system, because people aren't going to sort out all those different material streams, and they're not going to drive, 5 miles to recycle their materials. Unfortunately, that is at least the case for most people. So yeah, it's a challenge. I think, sometimes we get into a bubble in California where it's like, duh, we've recycled for 30 years. How do you not have a recycling bin? And that's just not the case for everyone.
I think some of these multi-material or hybrid packaging are often necessary for performance, like barrier or shelf life or something like that. But they're really tough at end of life. Have you seen any effective strategies that help simplify these designs without really sacrificing some of that functionality or brand expression?
Yeah, the multi-material packaging can be really tough. And the best strategies I've really seen are further downstream. For example, with cartons, like we've been told that, there's the film plastic layer, but the system that the recycler has developed can handle that. And, the plastic will float to the top and they can scrape that off, or I'm making that up a little bit, but the downstream recyclers have figured out systems to be able to manage some of those materials. And, I think the hope is that where that multi-material packaging is absolutely necessary, the brands work with downstream recyclers to, further develop like more facilities like that to really, be clear in what exactly makes up that multi-material layers, because I think sometimes it's a mystery. So I guess from the brand or packaging side, it would be, to be very clear, what is within that packaging, do research on, recyclers that can maybe it's working for, and then share that, information sharing is a big thing. We've worked with mills, where previously the plastic liner and like paper cups was problematic. And now it's not really that much of a problem anymore, because mills are talking to manufacturers are talking to recyclers and processors, and there's just a lot more conversation happening that everyone knows, like, okay, we've heard from people all up and down the value chain that we can make this work. So I think, to me, that's just a big piece of it, is not just sending it out into the market, but doing some research.
I want to touch a little bit on that about the validation and even certifications when it comes to things like recycling and composting. We see How to Recycle labels do a really great job of evolving to be as clear as possible to give people as clear instructions on how to recycle something. It's in the name. And even composting have their own set of certifications when it comes to BPI. And I think How to Recycle's looking into how to compost. And there's some collaboration there that I'm excited to see more of. In your opinion, how does those certifications and labeling really impact the consumer and end of life of a product interactions?
Yeah, labeling is critical, and I appreciate How to Recycle's efforts. And I think there's still work to be done. I think, in California, there were 2 bills passed to regulate the labeling of recyclability and compostability claims. Because until now, there's no regulation around it, and it's kind of contributed to just the Wild West. And particularly I'm going to shift it a little bit to composting because this is a topic I'm personally very passionate about, and from Recology's perspective as well. Compostable certifications like BPI, again, despite maybe good intentions, they're not adequate. They don't take into account real world composting conditions, and so what it's created is this significant challenge, particularly around bioplastics for composters, where something may be labeled certified compostable, but we know in the real world they don't break down. From what I can remember, like BPI certification only requires 90% degradation. And the question I have is what happens to the other 10%? So you've just got like little bits of microplastics hanging around in the compost. Well, that compost is supposed to be able to be sold to organic farms, to vineyards. And I just find it really problematic that these certifications continue to be pushed, again, without any regulation and without any real input from composters. So unfortunately, I don't think compostability certifications are where they need to be. But I do think, some of the work being done on recycling, labeling, and certifications is moving in the right direction.
Let's double click on that because that's interesting as it relates to compostability. So do you want to see compostable packaging coming into your compost stream, or is that something, and if not, then what do you see as the future for compostable packaging?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably one of the biggest questions that, at least in California, we're grappling with right now because of SB 54 and AB 1201. And, I think if you asked, a true composter, we pioneered curbside food scrap collection 30 years ago. We've been, doing it for a long time. And if you ask a true composter, they'll say that packaging adds no value to composting. The purpose of composting is to improve soil health, improve water retention, and that requires the feedstock to have like some nutritional value. That's why food scraps are great. You get, yard waste. It's very carbon rich, nitrogen rich material. Compostable packaging doesn't have any of that. I think the reason why composters accept compostable packaging is because it is often a vehicle for collecting food. You get a fiber food tray that has food scraps left over. You can throw it all in because we really want that food. And I think most composters, I don't want to speak for all of them, but fiber is not as much of an issue. I think it still needs to be regulated, make sure there's no PFAS or anything in there, but fiber is not as problematic. It's bioplastics that people really have concerns about. One, because it's very difficult to distinguish conventional plastic from bioplastic. There's no regulation around labeling. And again, because the bioplastics don't perform, 20 years ago, our processes were 120 days to make compost. Now we're coming up to 60 days and approaching potentially even 30 days to make compost. So packaging is not designed to break down that quickly. It's just not. And the compostability standards don't require it to break down that quickly. I think they require around 120 days. So there's just a big discrepancy in those standards with real world composting conditions. So there's a roundabout way, Chris, of saying, no, we typically don't want compostable packaging, but there's some that we're okay with, assuming that it can meet standards for PFAS, it can meet National Organic Program requirements, which is going to be a big part of AB 1201.
Wow. So I think that and I think I knew the answer there. And it's something that I've been kind of not struggling with, but just trying to figure out how do we get to a better future, because it seems like that compostable packaging stream is an important stream that we need to figure out. So it sounds like for it to work, it would have to fully break down within 30 days. And so maybe some of these fiber solutions that have very thin barrier coatings and things that can meet that standard would fit within that kind of guideline. But some of the traditional industrial compostable materials like PLA and other things are problematic in that stream. Are there any materials that give you hope in this compostable packaging or bioplastic space?
I know that there's been some development around like different types of foams from, bio-based materials. Like I live in Santa Cruz. Cruz Foam was founded here. I'm intrigued by it, but I do want to go back to one question that I actually didn't answer, Chris, which was what's the future for these materials in the system? And I don't want to paint such a grim picture. And so maybe I'll try to sprinkle in some optimism. We are trying to figure that out. I think people understand that shifting completely away from compostables would be a challenge. And I think there's some materials where it's easy to do so, and that should happen. And for the materials that can't, what does that look like? We've been having discussions, with the Producer Responsibility Organization, CAA, about what we as composters can do. And I think folks are going to try to come up with some kind of solution. Maybe it's like a bifurcated system where, composters that are willing to take these materials and maybe are willing to have a longer process, create a separate pile, a separate stream, and allow, more time or use specialized equipment to allow these materials to break down. Like that's a possibility. I don't know exactly what that would look like yet. And I don't know if there are composters out there that would be willing to do that. But, that is a part of SB 54 where, you could receive additional funding to do something like that. And so I imagine there may be someone that steps up and says like, okay, we'll take it. We're going to institute a 120-day composting process. We're going to use specialized equipment to make sure this stuff really breaks down. And then it's a matter of just like redirecting all the material to those facilities. I think it's a lot of extra work just to like preserve, this type of packaging that no one really wants. So, from my perspective, I think we need to be figuring out ways to either phase that packaging out or finding alternatives. But there is definitely a camp of people that are invested in making sure that packaging remains.
Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that your perspective on this provides a really critical perspective and a voice to the end of life of packaging, and really helps encapsulate what we're talking about when we talk about a circular economy. I think it's so important that when we are designing for packaging, we are considering end of life. So thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing your perspective. This has jogged a lot of ideas for me, and I'm excited to bring it back to the team and seeing what we could do with your insights. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak to different audiences, and I think brands and packagers is one of them. So always happy to join in the conversation.
That was such a great conversation. There are so many things that we talked about, so many insights that she gave us that I'm going to be thinking about as we work on projects here at the lab. One of the things that stood out to me was one of Julia's earlier points about how recovery really depends on the end markets. We can design a package to be compostable and recyclable and all these things with the best intentions. But if there is not a end market for it, if no one wants that material post consumer, it's not going to be recovered. And so, we really have to be thinking about that when in the design phase, for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, I also really loved her perspective on compostables. To me, that totally stood out. Fiber solutions seem like they have a good place, but most of the bioplastics simply weren't breaking down fast enough for these modern composting systems. When she said that the modern compost facilities that they have are now 30 days, and it takes a typical bioplastic 120 plus days to break down, I mean, that just was some real clarity to me about, how these systems have to be redesigned.
Absolutely. I think not only that, but to build off of that, what we need in order to be successful is that collaboration piece, where if we are designing something at the beginning of life, the brands are involved, the packaging providers are involved, the designers are involved. But if we don't include the people in the processes at the end of life, like recovery facilities, composters, recyclers, we all need a seat at the table in order to have the impact that we really want.
No, I think it's spot on. And I guess as I think for our listeners who are probably listening to this podcast right now, one hope that we have from this conversation is that this sparks some questions for you that you can take back to your teams, and really question how to design packaging that works not just for consumers, but works for the entire recovery process all the way through. So think about Julia when you're designing your package and knowing what she's going to have to do with it when it winds up at her facility.
So if you found this episode interesting, consider giving us a follow, sharing it with a colleague that might find it valuable.
And if you're looking for more information, more resources, you can find us at sustainabledesignlab.com, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.